Hi, this is Robin, and this is the first lecture for Humanities 303, How Do You Illustrate Water? Before I get going on this, just a couple of things. First of all, make sure that you've already checked Moodle for a list of questions that you should be thinking about while we go over this material. Secondly, in a classroom environment, I would be able to see if somebody had a reaction to something I said or a correction to something I said or I've misspoken and so on. And obviously we can't do that in an asynchronous format. So if you hear something that you feel is inaccurate or does not represent your experience, just let me know. There is a forum on Moodle for you to enter in that information, and you can also email me, and I will be issuing corrections. I think what I'll be doing is issuing corrections week to week if anything arises. Um, Finally, just a little thought about uh, how we interact with information differently. So when you're reading, when you're writing, when you're listening to me, and so on. I know from my perspective, teaching, that it's a different experience to speak to people asynchronously, knowing that you'll hear me at a later point where I'm not present is different. I think I'm a little bit more careful. I'm a little bit with that hesitation there. I'm a little bit more careful as I get used to this medium. And finally, one thing that connects to some of the larger issues that we're going to be exploring is the idea that I am publishing my voice in an audio format as opposed to writing this out for you. So you will have readings that you're looking at this week. And again, you take in that information differently, right? But also, one of the benefits of a verbal conversation is that there's a flexibility to it. So if you think about having a conversation with a friend, maybe you're talking about something, maybe you have different expertise that you bring to the conversation, and one of you may assert something, and the other one might issue not necessarily a correction, but an alternate point of view. There's a flexibility as you work out using body language and informal vernacular, all these things that you can do to flexibly arrive at a conclusion. When I publish an audio format, that flexibility begins to disappear, and yet it doesn't disappear entirely because I still speak more informally in this format than I would if I was writing an essay for you. So that's just something to be aware of, because one of the things I want to talk about today are differences and not differences, some relation to difference that's not a difference between text and image, and our other senses. So maybe before I dive into this, I'll just mention something that's been on my mind, which is thinking about the difference between book culture in medieval Europe as opposed to modern Europe. Prior to movable type in Europe, books were much rarer and more valuable and tended to be treated more communally. So, for example, people would be often reading together, and that reading and speech were much more connected, and hand, because you'd be writing out information when you were um, often you'd be writing out information. So these different senses were more connected to one another. And with printing, with more commercial printing and movable type, you get cheaper books, more access to libraries. For example, people can begin to develop private libraries depending upon their station in life, and begin to experience reading as a more private experience. And to some degree, I would say this maybe is happening with speech a little bit, so that you are experiencing a lecture instead of in a classroom environment with other people. You're experiencing that privately. And what happens in that case, right? You can interact with my voice in a different way. You can pause me when you want. Um, uh, so there are good things and bad things that come with all of these shifts in our access to technology and so on. And so I just think that this is actually a really excellent opportunity to be aware of that. This very odd year that we're having is a good time to be aware of that, and then bring what we learn forward to help us begin to manage some of the new technologies that we have available to us. And that will play a part as we go. So one final thing, sorry, probably like, okay, let's get going. Um, but one last thing, I'm going to try to remember to make a little sound effect when I switch slides. And the reason for that is that you might be the type of listener that needs to look away or like doodle or knit or something. And if that's the case, I'll do that so that you can have your attention brought back to what we're talking about and look at the next slide. But also, um, I will have a set of PDF slides available to you so that you can flip through the slides and then listen to the whole thing audibly if you want to. And then the final version of that is that if you are listening to a YouTube version of this, there should be a transcript that's available to you. And if you're on Kaltura, there should be subtitles available to you. So hopefully one way or another, you'll have access to what you need to help connect you to the material. I know for me that I can take in ideas audibly very well, but if somebody starts throwing facts at me and figures, I need to see it written down. And I don't know if you're the same way. The sound effect that I'm going to use, it's funny, I was trying to get some sort of complicated, like audio clip lined up, and it was too difficult. And I was asking my husband for help because he's an audio person, and he finally handed me a vase. So if I tap the vase, it makes this sound. So it sounds like this. Okay, so we've got some physicality in this situation. All right, so how do you illustrate water? How do you illustrate water? I thought was a really beautiful idea. It's actually taken from an article that I was looking at that was about lithographic prints, Inuit lithographic prints. Here's one of them. But I started thinking about, like, what is that? Like, everybody knows what water is. It's very universal. You can think for a moment about how you would illustrate water. And I want to explore this idea a little bit further. So here are some of the prints that were in that article. There was this piece here with a kind of a gradient. Oops. There was this line work, and of course, I just want to draw your attention to these for a sec because I'm going to get back to them. Here's springtime fishing. And then this piece here, there is some water implied in these lines, but also I would say the negative space we understand as water, or that's how I interpret this. I see that negative space as the water itself. So this is not from that article. This is a separate piece. This is Jean-Michel Basquiat. In this case, the water is represented by text. And so one of the things I want to do in this exploration is think about what it means when text stands in for image, or when image stands in for text, or where they might overlap. So what does it mean that large body of water here is represented by text? So one way that I could communicate water to you if I wanted would be through a written language, and you and I would have to have the same, understand both the same written language. If it's typographically expressed, like here we have syllabics that are hand rendered, but here this is typographic. Everything that you're looking at here, I'm using a font for. Now to get this syllabic font here, this is an Inuktitut font, I actually did not have that preloaded. I didn't have any preloaded fonts that would render these syllabics on my system. So I had to Google and download and apply those. And then in order to get the translation, I also did Googling. And of course, you can kind of maybe begin to see some of the complexities that arrive. If you have printing with movable type, one of the benefits of that is that it's a simple, flexible, accessible system. Everything that I've described to you is kind of free, like the font was kind of free, but of course I have to have the software to apply it. I have to have the computer to work that and so on. The fact that it's not as accessible as a font, whereas every other language that I'm going to show you in here, there's a preloaded version of it. It might not be my favorite version, but there's a preloaded version of every other orthography I'm going to show you. The fact that there wasn't a preloaded one on this is a window into some of the difficulties, troubles, problems that you can come up with when you have a apparently simple and flexible system like movable type. So for example, if you're thinking of a social media platform, I know that one of the barriers, or I know, I've read that one of the barriers for Inuktitut literacy is that when teens or young people are on social media platforms, there are sometimes barriers with keyboards. And this is true actually for many dialects. And so in that case, it may become easier, just like less annoying for the person to switch to a Roman orthographic system or even to English. And so even though technically it should be, quote unquote democratic, it doesn't quite shake out that way. So just to be aware of that. The other thing there is issues of standardization. I don't speak Inuktitut, and I would not want to drag on somebody's bandwidth or time for this. If it was for an essay, maybe I would do that. But I'm relying on Google Hits, and again, there could be standardization issues that flatten out different dialects because I don't come from that language community. Oh, sorry, I skipped over what syllabic means. Okay, so syllabic. This is alphabetic. This is syllabic. Syllabic means that you have it's a phonetic, but it means that you've got a full syllable, a consonant, and a vowel hooked together to express the sounds, as opposed to an alphabetic system where they're a little bit more broken up. It's a bit more granular. So you have a syllabic system, similarly an alphabetic system. A logographic system is a bit different, right? It's a full idea or a full word that's expressed in a character, and then ideographic is probably self-explanatory, and I would say that if you, let's say you cut out this boat here, you'd still understand that you were looking at water, possibly because of that ripple. But I think that the presence of the boat, this kind of very impressively large boat on the water, adds some shading to your understanding of the idea of water, the idea being presented. Okay, so if you have an idea, a symbol, here we have I love water. It's very easy for a contemporary person to read this, like a contemporary person to read this as I love, because we've gotten used to it. But the idea of interspersing symbol and text like this is, I would say it's a little bit under development, right? It has partly to do with printing technology that makes it much easier to incorporate a wider variety of items into type. But also, we're influenced by the very, very famous logo for New York, I Love New York, that Milton Glaser designed. The way that this functions is something called a rebus principle, REBUS. A rebus principle, it's almost like a visual riddle that you solve, where you see heart and you understand that heart is related to love. I love water. So this doesn't technically say I love water, but you read it that way. And in some respects, I would say, somebody push back on me if this doesn't seem right, but in some respect, I would say there's a logographic quality to that. That makes sense, right? And I think at this point, we've gotten to a situation where if I was to replace this with like a water drop or something, you might even be able to make that leap to that it's an abstraction of the heart. But you could also maybe read that as like I drink water. Like it might become confusing at that point, because you do rely on some sort of shared understanding when you're working with text like this. Now, some orthographies have a very strong calligraphic tradition as part of them, in which case the expressiveness of the text is in some cases part of what's being communicated, and that's here. So, for example, I can't read Farsi, but I can see, I can, see pictorially what's being presented to me. And of course, if I spoke the language, I would probably have a deeper connection to it, but I can still connect to it in some way. If you sort of approach that same idea, not calligraphically through preset type, I mean, this might actually be painted, I'm not completely sure, but or drawn in some way, but it's using the form, at least, of typographic type, which is much more abstracted from the human hand, but you can still follow what's going on here, right? So I believe that krogus means like a vessel or a jug, and this is containing the water expressed in these little blue W's. I probably didn't even need to explain that, right? It's visually apparent to you. Okay, so this here is at the top, these are Egyptian hieroglyphs on the top line, and at the bottom are Chinese oracle bone script and then bronze script along the bottom. I was really struck at how similar these are, and I wanted to focus on this trajectory here because you see two different tactics emerging as these orthographies develop. And one thing that I've noticed, especially as I'm putting together lecture material on orthographies, is how much our orthographies keep changing. So orthographies, by the way, maybe I should quickly stop and define that, right? So I'm actually going to pull this from Wikipedia and then talk about that for a sec. So I'm reading this to you from Wikipedia, and it's September of 2020. So it says, orthography is largely concerned with matters of spelling, and in particular the relationship between phonemes and graphemes in a language. Other elements that may be considered part of orthography include hyphenation, capitalization, word breaks, emphasis, and punctuation. Orthography thus describes or defines the set of symbols used in writing a language and the rules regarding how to use those symbols. Most natural languages developed as oral languages and writing systems have usually been crafted or adapted as ways of representing the spoken language. The rules for doing this tend to become standardized. Okay, so I'm going to pull back out of Wikipedia. Now, the thing about Wikipedia that I think is interesting is that, first of all, I know that everybody listening to this, because of how you got a hold of this audio, you have access to Wikipedia. And I also know that that Wikipedia definition could have shifted by the time you look at it. So it's a very weird situation in which it's published text, but the text remains, there's a fluidity to that text. That, if I wanted to hold on to it, maybe I would actually need to take an image of that particular formulation. So you can see that even there are issues that are affecting standardization and access and all these things. That, as with everything I'm going to mention, there are good and bad qualities to that. Good and bad are even sort of not even the right, not even quite the right standard to use, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, so to come back to this, so we've got hieroglyphics at the top and bone oracle and bronze script at the bottom. This hieroglyph here, with these kind of wavy lines that we've now looked at a couple of times, helped develop or turned into the modern phonic for M, sound. And if we go in the other direction, the logographic direction, we have a character that symbolizes water. And I just kind of want to walk down the street with that a little bit. And by bearing in mind that my native language is not Chinese nor Japanese, and I'm going to be referring to both of them in this bit here, in this section here. So what we're seeing here is the development of a syllabary, the origins of a syllabary. I apologize for my clicking, I'm just pulling something up. Okay, so this syllabary here in black, this is the katakana syllabary. It's one of two kana that Japanese employs to write out text phonetically. And so it was derived from Chinese characters that were used by Buddhist monks to indicate correct pronunciations of Chinese texts in the 9th century. And so what happened is that there were actually two syllabaries that were developed, and it's such an unusual situation. It's really interesting to me. So the katakana that you see here is for non-native Japanese words. So for example, if I was to write out my name Robin, this is a ro sound in katakana. This is the one that I would use to write out my name, and that would let the reader know that I'm not trying to express a native Japanese word. Similarly, if you read manga or something, katakana is also used for onomatopoeia sometimes, and for emphasis. So it's got other qualities in it. The other syllabary grass script, or hiragana, I apologize for my pronunciation, is the one that's used for native Japanese words, and was also traditionally considered more feminine. So it wasn't necessarily feminine to use it, but there's a canon of female literature and poetry that, by being expressed in grass script, retained a kind of feminine voice, which arguably provided a space for it in publishing culture. So the text itself, the form of the text, it's the same language, but it's adding different tones and social constructs around it. Okay, so here we have katakana. I want to take a look at this here. So this is the contemporary kana, and this would make a tsu sound, and this is the character that it was derived from. And this is my understanding, as best I can understand, that this character developed from this character and came to mean river or plains, is my understanding. So when I see it now in the contemporary environment, I'm often seeing it in relationship to Szechuan. And again, apologies if I've misunderstood this. I've tried my best to the moment. But the contemporary character for river is this. It looks different. And if I if I walk into another direction and look at the kanji that was developed from that character, this is the contemporary kanji for river, kawa. So this still means river now. And it exists as an independent meaning of this phoneme that was developed from it. So the phoneme means just a tsu sound. It could be anything with a tsu sound. And then if we grab hold of this character and walk in another direction, where many people who don't read a kana would have come across this is in Shruggy Emoji Guy. I can't remember what his name is, but we all recognize this, right? So, and this has a different quality, this kind of smiley face character that is, I believe, not in any way part of the phoneme itself. But we see it, and in fact, people have an amazing ability to see faces in everything. It's kind of like survival instinct that we have. So it's hard to not see it as a little smiley face, right? And here's a smiley face that is a super basic one. And I think it's interesting because these have both taken on very different tones. So for example, you know what, I just realized I have not been hitting the tone. I'm sorry. I'll start. If you've been looking away, pause and flip back 5 slides. I'll try to remember to do it. This is a new system for me, and I'm sorry. The smiley face here, I've had a few interesting conversations with classes of students, and in talking about it, have told me that it reads as a bit odd or overly familiar, even a bit creepy for somebody in a position of authority to use, blended into an email or some sort of written message sent to them. But of course, many people, many teachers, if I mention this to teachers, have no idea and will say, oh, I've been using it, I didn't know. So our understanding generationally, culturally, might vary from piece to piece. What a person might be intending to communicate to you might get. This is how these like little oligopolies of information and understanding form. So I don't actually ever use this in emails to students. And so I have this other issue that arises, which if I want to sound friendly or like, you know, I'm not annoyed with somebody or disapproving or something, I'm looking for other ways to put that into the text, either through my word choice or using an exclamation mark or whatever it is to add tone. So we have challenges that come with removing the human voice, right? And then finally, this character here, which is available to be used, you know, essentially logographically, symbolically, you know, because it means laughter and it looks like a little laughing guy. It works very well as a kind of, my understanding is kind of like a replacement of like a LOL. And I was speaking with someone who said that there is a trend towards just the Japanese for laughter is warai, that it has now, for some people, they've bypassed this and will write www as a reference to this word, the Roman expression of this logographic word. So I put this here to kind of show how flexible and constantly changing orthographies are. And a couple of things. First of all, orthographies change in relationship to one another. They also change in relationship to a sudden need that might arise, like the smiley face, or these expressions of laughter or what have you, partly arise as an issue of the fact that we've become a much more informally text-based culture, that we write to each other constantly so that our voice and face are not present. These help fill in that gap. Oh, I'm just kidding. Oh, I'm just laughing. Or isn't that funny? It's like a way of communicating. So there's a gap in what we have access to with the text. And so these help fill that gap. But then, of course, they could fill it in the wrong way, as in with this example. Okay, get ready. I'm going to remember to do the tone. So this is a quote from a designer, 20th century designer and futurist named Bruno Minari. And what he's talking about here is this idea that when you're communicating to an audience of people and you're using, graphics to do that, whether text or whatever, that you need to be aware of what they have already in their own minds that you're connecting to. So the example that he used was if you were using sort of like a silly typeface. He wasn't talking about Comic Sans, but that's a very universally understood version of what I'm talking about. If you use kind of like a silly or playful or commercial font to advertise the performance of an important classical opera, that you would not just be playing with the form, but that you would be just confusing the person. So it would be wasteful, was his point. So if we take a look at that same written expression in the Comic Sans, you can see to what degree your relationship with it changes. And I want to pause for a moment to talk about the color that we're looking at here. So this color, think for a moment about what you associate with this color. Okay, so this color is a Pantone 1837. It's a patented color that belongs to Tiffany's. Tiffany's has been using it since 1837. So there is, normally when we think of brand, we think of like a symbol or either a text-based or an image-based symbol that houses meanings that brand has hopefully accrued, that it's attempted to accrue. And so brands actually have value related to how successfully they've managed to do that. In the case of the Tiffany blue, this is housed in the color itself. And another 20th century designer named Paul Rand talked about how there was kind of a magic to this, that if you were to be, an independent company, not Tiffany's, you could borrow this blue, you could use this blue and immediately have transferred to you meanings and value that were built up by Tiffany's. It's kind of like a transfer that you could provoke. And that was true until 2001, when Tiffany's actually patented the color and patented it with Pantone, so they got control over this very particular color. If you're in InDesign or whatever and you want to pull up a Pantone 1837, you can't. It's not there for you. It's proprietary. So in this case, we see ideas solidified in a color and essentially also owned. So that's not text, but it certainly has properties of text, right? Let's see if I'm getting better at this. Okay, so this is just water in Roman text, Roman orthography. And here we see multiple Western European orthography, so English, German, Italian, French. Of course, these are modern concepts of nationhood. Those nations have not always existed. but there are different cultural, what's the word I'm looking for? There are roots attached to each of these languages. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a second because there's a lot going on here. So I want to talk for a second about movable type and image. So first of all, what you see on the left here is early movable type in Europe. So this would be from the 15th century onwards. And on the right is woodblock or xylographic printing. And so this is something actually that I wind up talking about in introduction to typography classes quite often, is the differences here. So there is some misunderstanding or miscommunication, mishistoricizing of the importance of Gutenberg's movable type that I want to talk about for a second. And one of those is the idea of what Gutenberg actually invented. So here what you see are individual characters locked into a form, and these would be inked and then printed to a page. Movable type did not originate in Europe. It originated in China, and metal movable type originated in Korea. What Gutenberg invented, because there was already a print culture that he emerged into, his technically what his invention was an adjustable type mold. And so what that means is this is flexible to width, it's not flexible to height. It's very difficult. Like if you can see, all these pieces have to line up to one another on the top and the bottom. You can pull this apart and you could swap this A out with an I, for example. But if you tried to swap this out with like a little tiny heart, for example, that was like not as tall as this, it makes the structure unstable. It makes it hard to work with. So there's a modularity and a mechanical quality to this that becomes part of printing. And so if you take a look at the development of a modern type form like this from a Roman orthography, as a Roman orthography, and you take a look at Gutenberg's original letter forms, first of all, you can see that there are shifts in the ability of the technology being developed to just be able to achieve these very, very fine lines, to be able to cast those and reproduce those, is a way of showing off that the technology has developed and become better. Nowadays, with digital technology, you wouldn't even think twice about that. But the other thing is that there is this complete abstraction away from the human hand. That's one of the key things about movable type. You lose evidence of the human hand. So this, for all intents and purposes, looks like somebody's writing. It's not. It's a representation of it. It's a copy of it, but it's not. And in this case here, what you're seeing is something that's not even intended to look like it was made by a human hand. It's divorced itself from that. Now, the idea there, the concept there is that it will then provide, a very clear window. This is the theory behind it. It will provide a very clear window for you to access the ideas that are being expressed by the text without being interfered with by a secondary person's expression, the person who's setting the type or so on. It's a different way of looking at abstraction. But we would say that this is abstracted away from the human hand. In xylographic or woodblock printing, the text is laid out by hand. So you're seeing an expression of the person who made the woodblock. You're essentially seeing their writing. And so their expressiveness and the way that they lay the type around other items on the page is both expressive and flexible. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to stop and think about for a sec before I move forward. One is the copyright implications in the different systems of printing. So, for example, here, copyright over time winds up belonging to the person who originates the ideas that are being reproduced here. And if you use this system, you're creating something that you're going to pull apart, because you need to pull these letters to, like these metal pieces, you need to pull them out of this configuration so that you can make new work all the time. So this doesn't remain consistent. In a woodblock printing situation, the woodblock itself is stable and consistent, and copyright in Japanese publishing at around the same period develops to belong to the person who owns the woodblock. So you might carve multiple woodblocks with the same image as the person who makes them, and whoever owns that woodblock can then reproduce it. There are different financial ramifications to each system on the part of the amount of risk that the publisher is taking on. But part of the reason that I've put these side by side, this is German, but this is French. One of the things that I'm interested in looking at is the development of publishing culture in France and in Japan between the 15th and the 20th centuries. There are a lot of overlap between them in terms of how standardization occurs, how a sense of modern nationality occurs, and a shared aesthetic, and so on. But whereas France adopted to movable type very quickly. Movable type is not developed in France, but France invests very heavily in designing movable type. And a lot of the type that we are going to be looking at throughout the term when I give you readings is in French-influenced type design. Whereas Japan received access to movable type technologically at about the same time, and as in France, the king in France and the shogun who had taken power in Japan both invested and were interested in movable type, but it simply did not take off commercially in Japan, and it was essentially rejected. So that commercial publishing develops with woodblock technology as opposed to movable type. So I think there's a lot of information there. I won't hold you on it anymore, but these are some of the things that I want to think about in terms of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about text. Is it typographic? Is it scribal? Is it carved? How is it reproduced? And so on. Those have meaning in terms of our relationships to the text, and also the value of like if there's a lack of scarcity, there could be then a devaluing, that type of thing. We'll talk about that more in a bit. Okay. That was anticlimactic. I haven't spoken very much about Korean movable type. I just kind of want to take a moment to acknowledge it. Like original metal movable type is a Korean invention. One of the things that I think is interesting about looking at history of the Hangul system is that the abstraction away from handwriting into something that's much more modular in character happens close to simultaneously, or from my perspective, quite close together, where there is a modular quality to the structure of the alphabet itself. Whereas in Europe, there's like a much longer time period between the technology and the modularity that occurs. So that this is actually like an expression, a modular expression of a letter form. But it occurs in stages. There's multiple stages to get from what looks like hand-generated text to machine or rationalist text. And in Korea, it kind of occurs much closer together, almost in one go. Okay, so I'm going to come back to these orthographies again, and I just place the different languages in what I would consider to be the vernacular, the typographic vernacular that they come from. So in English, for example, did I forget to do the tone thing? Maybe I shouldn't have tried to do a tone thing. Maybe I'm not sophisticated enough to do this yet. Let me go back. Okay, here we are with the orthographies. In English, English has a very strong connection to Germany, which I tend to forget about. But you can see here the word water, Wasser. I should check the etymology of that, but I believe that there's a connection. But at any rate, for English people, children up until not that long ago actually learned black letter and not Roman. This is Roman, this is black letter. And that's a surprise for contemporary English-speaking people because this seems so impenetrable. Like, it's actually very difficult for me as an English reader to comfortably read black letter. So the idea of early, little kids, that would be what they would learn first is a bit odd to me, but it's the case. So here we have black letter, and it's got strong evidence of a human hand in it. It's reference to script. These this Roman text for aqua is connected to the Trajan columns in Rome. It's got this very ancient Roman connection. And then here, the contemporary lowercase Roman alphabet, which we rely on to read long form text. It's what gives text shape for anybody reading in English or in French, is heavily French influenced. There are a lot of early designs are developed by French designers, and the French king invested in that design early on. Back to just water, just plain water, just as a word. So if I was to just write the word water typographically like this, there's no evidence of my hand. I have chosen a particular font to work with, but you could certainly make the argument that this is a very impersonal font, right? It doesn't have a lot of expression to it. If I didn't draw your attention to it, you might not think about it at all. There is an abstraction involved in that, in which you might think of any water that you like, what water means to you. If you tend to think about water in a more sensory way, the fact that it's wet, or the fact that it's like cold or hot or whatever, or drinking water or ocean or whatever, there's an abstraction there between us. If I just write water, there's a simplicity to that. So this is a poem by Emily Dickinson. I am not going to read poetry to you. No one needs to hear me read poetry. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between laying out text in typographically like this, and laying it out, or its connection to handwriting. So if you have a situation like this, here is a book of poems by Emily Dickinson. So here we have Roman type. This is something that we're still comfortable and familiar with for English speakers. Here we have this kind of more traditional black letter type, and notice that it says edited by two of her friends. There's a softening of the authority of this that's indicated by that friends. There's the name of the imprint, so who has a commercial interest in this. And then there is, and of course this would be in every single edition more or less the same. There will be little variations sometimes between editions and so on, but there is some consistency there. And then here you have a scribal tradition included into the same space, and it is more expressive, it's more individual, and it is much harder to read. So one of the things about movable type is it doesn't just arrive in Europe and then there's an immediate switch to a typographic tradition. Scribal traditions hang on for a variety of different reasons. Personal correspondence. Sometimes you have forms to fill in, like a governmental form where there is some printing and then you add your own writing, or what have you. And then there is also a sort of interesting sort of extra thing here, which is that there are some female poets who either are not, they don't necessarily have the same access to printing technology all the time. They're rarer. But also sometimes somebody who does have access, like Emily Dickinson, will continue to make editions that are just scribal. And so the implications of what it means to be printed are worth thinking about here, in terms, not just in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of a voice that you might not feel comfortable with. It's sort of the equivalent. This is like a louder voice than this in some respects. This is able to communicate to a wider variety of people. So if you do like 30 30 copies of a poem by hand and give it out to people that that's a much quieter way of speaking to people around you than an edition that's in several hundred. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into the phonics situation for a reason I'll get to. So the other script that we looked at was the katakana. This is a hiragana, which is like for native Japanese words and is also sometimes referred to as grass script and has that potentially feminine quality to it. I want to be clear that I'm like men also would use this. I don't know. I don't want to indicate that it was like a woman's script, but just that it had that connotation to it as well. So this is a syllabary, so the way that this functions, this is mi, and this without this modifier is su. So if you were to write, for example, like miso or something, you could still use this mi in another word, so mi, su, and then this hardens, this diacritic here hardens this to become a more of a zu sound, so this becomes mizu, or water. And I apologize for my pronunciation, but okay. And here is the logographic variation in Japanese of the same word. So this also expresses misu, water, and I believe is more commonly used. Like if you were an adult Japanese reader and writer, this is what you would be using. If you were a child or somebody who's learning, you might still see it written out in the phonic hiragana. And in fact, in books, there is something called a furigana, which is like if you had this logographic text here, there might be a little reading guide to the side that breaks it down into this so that somebody who's a less sophisticated reader would have access to it. So it's a way of allowing both of those or allowing this system to be in place, as well as having the benefits of more accessible literacy included. So here are 3 versions of a poem by Basho. These are all 3 of these expressed in Japanese. This is with a more common mixture of hiragana and kanji, so like with the characters and the phonics. So this here, this says the same thing each time, and we're going to talk about this line for a minute. So this says, and I apologize again for my pronunciation, but mizu no oto, mizu no oto. This is in the phonics, and then this is in Roman orthography, which would be accessible to somebody like me quite easily. I can see that this is mizu no oto. None of these tell me what that means as somebody who's not a Japanese speaker. This is the easiest one for me to Google. However, nowadays, because there are so many more, the way that digital platforms work, I could also grab this, Google it, and translate it and get that information. So there's a flexibility that has arrived with digital platforms. So let's take a look at translations of it. So here in the corner we have the one that's the mixture of the logographic and the phonic. And these are different English translations of it. Now, the first 2 lines remain relatively consistent, right? There's an old pond and a frog jumping one way or another. It's the last line where something shifts. The first 2 translate this more directly as the sound of water or water's sound. The second 2 take poetic license and fill in that space. So to say splash or to say kerplunk, those are different, and they fill in the space of what I would imagine a frog leaping to sound like. If you just say the sound of the water, there is more space given for the reader to imagine what that might be, right? And so I think there's something quite interesting about, for example, Allen Ginsberg choosing to do something which fills in my understanding of the sound of a frog splashing in the water. He directs my experience more. And I think it's worth for you, for example, taking a moment to think about what experience you prefer. Obviously, there's no right or wrong to this. Okay, and so this is that same poem written out by the poet himself in the 17th century. For me personally, although I've tried to familiarize myself with some of the characters, this is really challenging to read. I can pick out some, but some just becomes almost impossible for me. And so if you think about the difference in this and this for clarity here, even if I don't understand this, I can sort of pick my way through it or copy and paste it into Google or something. This is, there's a more of a distance from this, but in terms of the meaning of it, the content of it, but the poet is more represented in expression. And so there are, do you see what I'm saying? There are different possibilities in each form. So this particular character is not only a Japanese character, of course, it's derived from a Chinese character, and they share this written expression of the word for water, but there are different words attached to that character in each language. It's still functioning logographically. And here we can see ice, and you can see with your eyes the water in this word, but there is a modification and it becomes ice. In the case of Chinese, there's a tone as well that's implied, which is hard for someone like me to, I can hear it, but it's very hard for me to express it. So I'm just going to play it. Now that's the Google version of it. That's what I have access to at the moment. I want to dig into, I've highlighted Chinese here because I want to dig into this for a minute. So here are two characters for rain, and in this case these are both within Chinese, both attached to the same word, but one is simplified and one is traditional. So one of the things about writing, choosing, like when you write something, is that you lose things like facial expression and body language and stuff like that. But there are other elements that come into the space, and they are more rigid in a way. So if you choose to write something out in Chinese and you choose a simplified set of characters or you choose a traditional set of characters, there are choices implied in that that become concrete once they're written down, right? Now, for somebody like me who is not a native Chinese speaker or reader, it's hard for me to see the difference unless it's pointed out to me. If I see written traditional or written simplified characters, it's easy for me to get them mixed up. For somebody who is a Chinese speaker, therefore, there are other layers of meaning in that written sequence of characters. Now, for rain, I think it functions very clearly logographically. It really looks like rain, and I think if you're listening to this and you're not a native Chinese reader, I have a feeling this one might stick with you, as you might recognize it again in the future because you look at it and you see it and you've got it. Now that doesn't mean, for me, that doesn't mean that I can write it because I don't remember things like stroke order, and I probably would forget variations on it, but recognition and being able to write are two separate skills. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Roman orthography for a little bit and look at this poem by James Baldwin. Now, as with Emily Dickinson, I'm not going to read this poem aloud, but I will share an interesting experience I had when I was setting up the recording for this. It was my intention to find a recording of James Baldwin reading his own piece because, of course, unlike Emily Dickinson, there are recordings of him in existence, and he reads his own work. I could not actually find a recording of it. I thought I had, and when I clicked on it, I thought I was going to get his voice, and I'm going to play his voice for a minute so you know what I was expecting.
And I'm reading them, in a sense, as much to myself as I am to all of you.
Okay, so that's what I thought I was going to get. When I press play...
Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please. A little. Do not get carried away by the sound of falling water. The marvelous light on the falling water. I am beneath that water. It falls with great...
So it actually interrupts itself there to play another ad. It's playing an ad for a detergent. Just super weird. It's a weird way. It's a weird place to pause. The whole thing is just completely odd. But it sheds a really interesting light, I think, on our relationship between what we hear in our head and what we read. Because although I don't know how James Baldwin would read this exactly, in knowing the rhythm of his speech and having some understanding of the timbre of his voice, I can kind of imagine him reading it, but it's just my imagination. But if I'm just coming across this in a book, I'm likely to connect more to like an internal voice that I have when I hear. Now, I don't know what other people's internal voices are like, first of all. But secondly, we experience text differently depending upon how visually we think. So some people, when they read a word like rain, visualize rain, and some people don't. So we have that kind of different relationship with it. Now, this style of writing that we're seeing here, sorry, which is not writing, it's type. I spoke about this earlier, but this is a combination of evidence of a human hand in terms of how this is structured. It's got reference to traditional scribal writing, but it's also to some degree divorced from the human hand. It expresses the machine that makes it in its structure. A person doesn't write this perfectly and cleanly. And in fact, you can see this is laid out along the grid that is required by Gutenberg's letterpress. These very straight lines. The way that the text is broken functions with that particular grid. It's prescription. It doesn't break that grid, nor should it have to. The idea here is that you see through the text to get to the expression that James Baldwin is intending to share with you, the words that are in his mind. It connects your mind to his mind in some way is the idea. It's one way of connecting to another person asynchronously, right? The other aspect here is that James Baldwin is someone he's a black man in America. He's grappling with race. He leaves America to work in France, and here you see him working in English with a largely French orthographic tradition, also Roman, and all the complexities of that. He's resisting something, and also needing to work within that system. You can't think outside of the language that you're raised in, right? And even when he learns French, he's connecting to traditions that connect France and America largely through printing, concepts of ideals of liberation and so on, but also colonization. And the printing press is a primary tool of colonization. So the complexities and the contradictions and the tissues that are embedded in this are endless, and you could probably write a very, very long essay on this. And so when I hear the robot speaking it, the surprise of that causes me to experience the information differently. I don't know if it did that for you, but there's actually something to me weirdly moving about the robot reading it. Yeah, so it's worth meditating for a moment at your end how you experience text, how you read it, and what it's like when you hear it read to you, and so on. Okay. Okay, so this, unlike the James Baldwin piece that we just looked at, does actually defy the grid. It's consciously working against the grid, and it is specifically a French poem. Now, because in reading English or in French, we line up our letters on a baseline. We read by shape, and we read in straight lines. This messes with our ability to comfortably read. And so the question becomes, to what degree are we even intended to read this? How are we intended to read this? This is very comfortable to read, and this is a very orthographically French expression of this text. This becomes something that's visual. Are we looking at a picture, or are we looking at text? Now, if I show you that same writing, and it is laid out in such a way that it's more comfortable to read. I mean, these line lengths are also uncomfortable, but anyway. You can kind of scan the French, you can scan the English, you can get a sense of your connection to the actual content of it more easily. And also, it's worth thinking here about what happens when text is translated. The rhythm of the original poetry, the difference between the sound of "oh gouttelette" or "oh little drops." That feels different, right? "Oh gouttelette" has like a very raindroppy feeling to it. I would argue a little bit more than "oh little drops." That's not to say it's a bad translation, but just that when you're reading a translation, of course, you're also reading the person who did the translating, and that's an invisible variable that you're dealing with. And similarly, typesetting, it's also an invisible variable that you're dealing with. You're ideally not thinking about it and not noticing it, it invisibilizes itself. Okay. So it's raining and it's raining. These are both ways of visually playing with and expressively playing with the content. Here you have something that's calligraphic, and here you have something that is trying to be playful in a printing press format. And there's so many things that this is working against, that part of what this is talking about is working against those things. And the relationship, for example, that France had with the printed words. So there is this hierarchy that comes into place where the expressions of the printed word or the written word gain a priority in the expressive arts. Okay, so I'm going to read that. Okay, I'm going to read a couple of lines about hierarchy in the arts in France from a text by a writer named Hokanson. I will put the citation in the notes. Okay, so he says, the post-Renaissance tradition of the hierarchy of the arts and the rivalry of poetry and painting had been essentially restated in Romantic aesthetics by asserting the synthetic powers of the literary text. In French aesthetic discourse through the 1840s, literature's ostensible superiority continued to lie in the verbal medium's ability to englobe and synthesize all the other arts: the rhythms of music, the visual objects of sculpture, the colors of painting, the structures of architecture. And what I think is interesting about that is twofold. One is that there is this primacy of the written word in Europe that's connected partly to the prestige and power of the technology of the printing press and a focus on developing that, but also that is displaced in the 19th century, that's important to recognize, and that there are commercial aspects to that displacement as well as cultural ones. The second thing is this idea that the reason that text was perceived as having a superior quality to it is that it was able to synthesize the other arts, that it was able to contain them. And so I would say, I'm just going to race back through these to get back to that. So this idea that an abstract alphabet can be developed and create a space in which all of these other rhythms and colors and sounds and so on can exist in your imagination. In some respects, I would say it's just a different way of creating an abstracted space for expression, if that makes sense. So there is space for the viewer in a situation like this to connect with what the actual texture of wood is like. It doesn't need to be a direct representation of what wood is like, because it allows you to think about what wood feels like to the person who made this, and what wood feels like to you. There is space for the viewer and the reader, and this arguably, I think, makes space for the the person experiencing the art potentially in the same way, if that makes sense. This is something that I've been grappling with myself, with the purpose of abstracting letter forms away from the human hand is. So to come back to this particular piece here we have other levels of abstraction. This is beginning to abstract from the written word itself and pull it right back around to a visual, but of course it's a very abstract visual. It's not, so that this is really a break of tradition with something like this, where you see a very mimetically, this is a very mimetic approach to communicating water to you. You can see the water. If you were to close your eyes and I said, hey, imagine rushing water, well, you might imagine rushing water in a very wide variety of ways. This is very prescriptive. There's a rock here, this is where the water splashes, and so on. It doesn't give you that same space. And when I think about that mimetic tradition, I believe that connects, for example, with the idea of saying kerplunk or splash instead of saying the sound of water, in terms of the space between you and the person who is communicating the idea to you. In some respects, also, you could say that that connects to the rebus principle that we spoke about at the beginning of this idea where you interact with that heart to fill in the meaning. Heart is love, and so on. I wonder if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. If we were in a classroom together, this is something I would ask you about. And I'm very curious to hear your responses to that. But at any rate, one way that you could describe this would be its mimetic quality, which is a key part of a big chunk of European art history, is a mimetic aesthetic. Okay. So in this particular case here, this is a spread from a book that was printed in the 1800s, I believe. Because of the lack of grid structure, because this is not made with movable type, the same quality that we saw in the calligram of text that is in a raindrop formation is present, but it's more naturally integrated into the rest of the image, and there's less of a separation between the text and the image. And similarly, the lettering itself is much more expressive and also harder to read. This is for me more challenging to read. But again, I'm what you the typographer Ellen Lupton has a quote. You know, like you read what you see, or I'm messing that up. We read best what we see best, or something. So if you've been raised reading black letter, you can read black letter. If you've raised reading more expressively written characters, you can read those, and so on. For me, this is a challenge. I did spend quite a bit of time trying to work out where to find the word rain in this, for example. Okay. So this last slide is a man performing water calligraphy. And I thought this was an interesting place to sign off because most of the text that we've looked at, the purpose is for it to perform some sort of function, asynchronous communication, more or less. And in water calligraphy, it's ephemeral, and it's more about the act of writing or connecting to the text through your body. It's not really intended to outlast the action. So in terms of our understanding of text and what text is for, I think this is a good thing to take into the week with us in terms of what is our relationship with text. When do we use text in such a way that it is ephemeral? I think on social media sometimes that's the case, and so that can be a bit of a roller coaster. Yeah, so I hope that you enjoyed this. Or at least made it through, and I will be curious to hear your responses, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.